I've recommended books online for a while now, longer than I'd care to say, but it was only earlier this year that I started thinking more specifically about the differences between suggesting a book in person and online. And I'm not here to say that YouTube isn't my real life, online experiences are a part of life, but when I'm speaking in a video like this, there's some level of context collapse. I can guess who my audience is, but I can't know that for sure. And I don't have a specific person in mind. But when I'm out and about and I'm talking to a coworker or my hairdresser or someone I just met at a party or a friend of a friend who's looking for a holiday book recommendation for a certain family member, then I'm talking to a specific person with specific experiences and preferences. And really individual taste is so random, and that's especially true if it's not somebody's main area of interest. Like if a person likes books but doesn't think about them that much. So I started wondering, when the rubber has hit the road and I've been asked to name a book for an individual eclectic person, which titles have I actually recommended? A lot of my favorite books are well documented on this channel, but it turns out there are certain titles that have gotten the call in person over and over, and I hadn't thought about them in those exact terms before, but after considering it, here are the 10 books I think I've probably recommended the most. The first 3 are books I read years before I started making book videos, so I don't actually know if I've mentioned them on camera before, but elsewhere out and about I've mentioned them to a lot of people. So the first of those is Barbara Kingsolver's novel, The Bean Trees. It's funny, I've read maybe a dozen of Kingsolver's books. I've read her novels, short stories, essays, poetry, her food memoir, but I haven't read Demon Copperhead, the one everyone else has read. But I have a real soft spot for her early novels, especially this first one, which was published in 1988. And I recommend it often because of the voice. The main first-person narrator has such a bright and warm voice to her. It's lively and it's lovely. The main character's name is Taylor Greer. It's a name she gives herself when she leaves her small Kentucky town in a car she knows is going to break down. So she heads west and decides that wherever her car does break down, that's where she'll start the next stage of her life. And the first time she has car trouble, she runs into an abandoned baby, and the story goes from there. Part of what works so well here and has continued to work for Kingsolver is that she herself is from Kentucky. She's from Appalachia, and she made literature out of the voices she knows best. And publishers found that there was a broad market for that. Do I think that was a learning moment? No. Publishing is as publishing does. Actually, the lesson that was probably learned from that is, well, we already have our one Appalachian author. Do we really need another on the list? The next one I wanted to mention is a novel called Disgrace by the South African Nobel Prize winner J.M. Coetzee. It's such a funny time capsule that I have the movie tie-in edition. Like, what are you doing here, John Malkovich? This is the cover that most of you will encounter. Anyway, this is the kind of book that I prefer to discuss in person because it's polarizing. Not in terms of quality, to be clear. This was published in 1999 and it made Coetzee's name abroad, and it's very well regarded. And if you read it, you'll sense that this is a writer in command of prodigious talent, but it's such a pessimistic book. It's subtle, it's enigmatic, and its main character is just... I'm trying to think of a better phrase than he's a piece of shit. He's a white South African professor in his 50s who's writing an opera on Lord Byron, and that tells you most of what you need to know about how he sees himself and women sexually, and the dominant and comfortable role he envisions himself playing in the world by default. And then he loses everything through his own actions. In Disgrace, he goes to live on his daughter's farm, and in the countryside, he faces a newly independent country that's changing in ways that are unsettling to him. It's a violent book. There are no heroes. There are very intense ethical and philosophical questions that have engendered countless interpretations. And throughout, Coetzee's writing is clean and calm. In its discipline, it is mesmerizing, and many people find they want to keep reading the writing, even as they might not actively want to keep reading the story. It's an odd one. In a sense, it's aged well, and it's also not a book for the 2020s necessarily, and I understand that. But there are readers who are drawn to the unlikable and to almost distressing levels of ambiguity, and who want to experience those qualities in a way that's artful and not uncomfortably bumbling like a lot of provocative writing. So that's why it's gotten the call. This third book might be the most popular one on the list. It's The Complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, translated from French by Anjali, Singh, Mattias, Ripa, and Blake Ferris, different translators for different volumes over time. It's an autobiographical graphic novel where Satrapi tells the story of her childhood in Iran during the period of the Islamic Revolution, and then her teenage years in Vienna, and finally her decision to leave Iran again as an adult. And I've kept recommending it to people over the years because it has basically a 100% success rate, even and especially with people who don't normally read graphic novels. It has that mouse quality to it. Satrapi captures how childhood and early adolescence are so cute and charming and funny, but also confusing and scary and undignified. And there are a lot of these universal moments within a specific story of the rise of religious extremism in the 80s and the ways that impacted Iranian women's freedom, especially. This also deals with political persecution and what happens when a regime comes to power that punishes those who express opposing views. And Satrapi and her family did, and they paid a price for that. This was first published in French in 2000 and then in English in 2003. And the United States is tremendously Islamophobic at the best of times, let alone in the year 2003. So that's a big reason for its incorporation into a lot of curricula in high schools and colleges here. And I don't want to treat such a layered story as though it's primarily a learning opportunity that feels condescending to both the writer and to the book's readers. But it's nice when that's such a natural part of an already really good book. Persepolis has been an entry point on contemporary Iran for a lot of readers, and not just Western readers either. And it's also just a moving story of an individual life. Okay, I realize that surprisingly, this is one of the classics I recommend the most. It's Anthony Trollope's Barchester Towers, which is the second book in a loosely connected 6-book series called The Chronicles of Barchester, but you can read them individually. A lot of the books on this list are short. That definitely helps when you're suggesting books to people who are already so busy and whose lives are already stuffed to the gills with other priorities. But when I'm talking to someone who loves long books, classic or contemporary, I'll typically recommend Trollope to them because most English speakers have more forced familiarity with his contemporary, Charles Dickens. We were assigned Dickens in school. And Trollope is great for the many people who kind of like Dickens, who appreciate his humor, his wit, his social commentary, but who just didn't fall in love because Trollope has all of that, and he's meaner and more fun. I said in my recent video on Victorian novels that there's a Jane Austen-like quality to a lot of Trollope's narrators. There's that judgment and irony and edge to them. And I recommend Barchester Towers because it's a fan favorite. A lot of devoted Trollope readers came to him through this novel, which starts at the deathbed of an archbishop and follows a bunch of pathetic social climbers as they try to succeed his position and influence. And toward the end, there's a garden party scene where everything goes down. I will say too, and I've said this to a number of people, his books fly. Their length is deceptive, and it can be really cool to finish these chunky books and feel like you didn't actually do that much work. Next is a nonfiction book, really an extended essay by Susan Sontag called Regarding the Pain of Others. And here I have a bias because this is a response about 20 years later to one of her earlier and more famous books on photography. So why don't I recommend On Photography to people, or even Against Interpretation, which is her first collection and more influential. And it's simple. It's that I started with this one and it's how I came to love her work. So I guess I project that onto other people and I think, well, hey, I guess it might work for someone else too. But there are a few other elements influencing my thought process. This is a reckoning with the way humans have interpreted images of suffering. She's questioning our assumption that cameras capture the truth, and she's also questioning our true reactions to the visualization of pain and fear and loss. Do we feel compassion when we see that? Do we feel closer to people or further away when we witness their suffering? What are the power dynamics involved? And how do the answers to these questions change depending on which people and which circumstances we're looking at? I think homing in on photography as a technology, isolating its cultural impact, and also isolating one form of photography really gives this book a blend of depth and digestibility. digestibility. And because this is so short and so focused, it can help people overcome any intimidation factor with an author who's as famous and as cerebral as Susan Sontag. I mean, there are plenty of people who have this sense that she's for other people they maybe imagine to be smarter or better read than they are. And I'm not saying that all of Sontag's work is for everyone, but there's a power to actually reading an author like that, to seeing what you make of her work and knowing that you can read her if you want to. When it comes to fantasy recommendations, of course I've mentioned Robin Hobb to a lot of people. Hello, she's in the background of a ton of my videos. But for people to read even one of her trilogies is a commitment, and I know that. So I realized there's a fantasy book I've recommended way more than any others, A Brightness Long Ago by Gavriel Kay, because it's a standalone. It's a satisfying single book that's also not the length of an encyclopedia. Kay typically writes a combination of historical fantasy and low fantasy, meaning there aren't any super intricate magic systems you have to keep track of, and I enjoy that kind of thing, but a lot of readers think that high fantasy is all the genre has to offer. What you get with A Brightness Long Ago is a kind of alternate history fantasy setting that's modeled after the city-states of Renaissance Italy. So, for example, you have a horse race scene that's completely thrilling and that's modeled on the Palio in Siena. The story's told from two main perspectives, one in first person well after the events of the novel and the other in third person during those events. And as a performance, it all works. There's no dragging or dilly-dallying, but you do spend quality time with characters you really come to care for. It's polished but not stiff. It's poetic without being self-conscious. It's just an example of an experienced writer who was in form. And it's not uncommon for me to feel excited about a book only to recommend it to people who don't have the same reaction to it. That's tragic, but normal. But what's interesting about this one is that the people I've recommended it to overwhelmingly have come back to me with the same reaction I had. They've said, this was a fantastic read. And it's like, yes, it is. Something we can all agree on. All right, another nonfiction book. This one is Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder, and I recommend it because if there's one thing this World War I girl knows, it's that you all love the sequel, but it's a World War II with a twist. Two twists, really. The first is time frame. Instead of 1939 to 45, his focus is 1933 to 45. And that's because of the second twist, which is geographic. This isn't about Germany or the Russian part of the Soviet Union. Not really. It's about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Poland, and then most prominently, Ukraine and Belarus. It's about what the people of those lands collectively suffered under two of the most brutally murderous regimes in history. So Snyder combines events that are usually analyzed separately, events like the Holodomor and the Holocaust, the purges of 1937 and 38, and the murder of prisoners of war. And he does this because he's taking a bird's eye view of how these men and their political apparatuses went about mass political killings, which they did overwhelmingly in this corridor of space that's still relatively overlooked in studies of the time period. I personally valued Snyder's work even before he became a kind of celebrity historian because he has the chops to write about German and Russian history, but his background is East Central Europe. It's a kind of anti-imperial history, not by design, I would imagine, but it's fundamental all the same. He has such an interest and a knowledge of these places that are still treated as peripheral. And I've had a lot of people tell me after reading this that they were familiar with some topics going in, weren't familiar with others, but that everything was presented in a slightly unfamiliar way. Weirdly, on this list of 10 books, there are 2 Hungarian novels, which I guess is less random for me than it would be for plenty of other people, but still. The first of those is The Door by Magda Szabó, translated from Hungarian by Len Rix. And I won't say too much about this here because if all goes to plan, dangerous statement. Warning, warning. If all goes to plan, this will be featured much more extensively in an upcoming video. But the most recent person who read this on my recommendation was my uncle, who's super picky. He's a really refined reader in some ways, and then in others, he's a complete wild card. Like, how could I know you wouldn't enjoy The Remains of the Day because apparently you don't like Butler stories, Uncle Peter? But he really liked The Door, and when my aunt asked him why, he was like, you know, it's hard to explain what it's about. I always say it's about a writer and her housekeeper and their decades-long relationship that's difficult to define, that's bizarre and comical and very, very serious. And the housekeeper is just a force of a character and somehow unknowable, more so the more you get to know her. I love this novel to pieces, and even though it's had several major moments in English language publishing and in other languages, most people I know still haven't heard of her. This is still pretty far off the beaten path for them, and it's fun for me to introduce other people to her books. The second Hungarian novel is Embers by Sandor Márai. Carol Brown Janeway translated the English from the German translation of the original Hungarian, and as much as I love her interpretation, I'm glad that it seems like his later books that were published in English were translated directly from Hungarian. Like, what are we doing here? I talked about another novel of his called The Rebels earlier this year, but there's no debate as to which of his books is the best. It's this one. So first off, this is just over 200 pages and it has large font. So you blink and you've read 30 pages. And that's also true because of how the story flows. It really is like a clear river of prose. This is a book about the embers of two lives, of a friendship, and of an empire. It takes place in a mostly deserted Hungarian estate where a former general and his former best friend reunite after not seeing or speaking to each other for more than 40 years. And over the course of this one night, they venture into the past together, into a world that truly no longer exists, that's unrecoverable. It's a melancholy and moody, but emotionally propulsive book that casts a kind of spell over readers. And that's why I love recommending it, even and especially as a left field pick, as something the person wouldn't normally read, because it's not a big investment. And then all different kinds of readers come out of it feeling like they've experienced something special. There's one book, though, that I've recommended more than any other, so I've saved it for last. Sometimes the snow comes down in June, sometimes the sun goes around the moon, and more than sometimes, a lot of times, I've recommended The Cost of Living by Deborah Levy. And strangely, I have like a 90% success rate of people actually reading this soon after I've recommended it, which is unheard of. My recommendations, like everybody else's, go gently into the TBR ether, and I have no illusions about that. But what I think has happened with this one is that I've pitched it to someone, and then the next time they're in a bookstore or library, they've picked it up, they've started reading it, and that's it. They're in. This is Levy's account of the period after her divorce, when her children are growing up and leaving home and her mother is dying. So suddenly she's not defined primarily by the roles of wife, mother, or daughter. So who is she now? Who is she societally as she appears to others? And who is she to herself? What is this middle stage of life that's somehow a new life? She's trying to find what she calls a new way of living as a writer, as a woman, and as a homemaker in a solo home. And I have to say, there have been a lot of cosmetically similar books that people have recommended to me over the years that I found frustrating because it's like, this is a series of unconnected thoughts. This isn't a book. It's not even really an essay. It's not profound. Like, why do we need to feel like a certain form is profound, even if the content is not? Is it because of some inherent aloofness to the structure? Or is it what I suspect, that readers can oftentimes be more thoughtful than the books they're reading? In any case, to me, this is the real deal. It's spare with purpose. It's efficient and careful and generous, just so generous with what she shares. It's an inquiry into an era she didn't anticipate in her life. That's the kind of era many people experience in their own lives, and she captures its strangeness, beauty, loneliness, its gifts. And it's been a small gift in my life that other readers have seemed to feel that way about it too. Thank you for watching and for spending this time with me today, whenever today is for you, and I'll see you soon for another video.